Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here this afternoon, so thank you for staying along for the next hour or so. What I would like to speak with you about today is the topic of behavioral economics. This is something that we've invested quite a bit at Swiss Re, and I know that there's a various level of knowledge in the room, which is why I will spend some time introducing the subject to you. I will give a few examples as to what we mean with behavioral science, where we're coming from, and then talk a bit about how we are going about applying these topics to insurance. Before I go on, can everyone hear me okay, including in the back? Is it better now? Okay, thank you. Right. So let's speak about behavioral economics. And I'd like to start with a little picture to kind of test what it is that we see on the screen. So this here is a very well-known example of cognitive dissonance. And maybe some of you have even seen this picture before. And usually you would be asked to say, when you focus on the light gray circles on this picture, do you believe that they're of a different size, or are they of the same size? The answer, so I'm not going to put you on the spot, but the answer is quite clear. So they are of the same size. However, it's very difficult for our brain to comprehend that. How can I make you see what I mean? I can just change the context. So if I draw these two parallel lines on the picture, all of a sudden you see that the light gray circles are of the same size. However, if I take that away, although if I have already told you what it is that we see, it's still very difficult for our brain to comprehend that idea. Going forward, this was a kind of like a very nice visual introduction to the fact that what we see is not always what we actually perceive or reality. And there's many, many examples of this kind of stuff everywhere around us. And what I'm going to show you next is another very simple question. So if I show you this picture, and I would ask you to read out loud what you see. So I would ask you to name the colors of the words that I have written on the screen. It's not a trick question. If I would start reading that out loud, it's quite quick. So it's blue, green, red, and so on. There's no trick, and you were able to do that very quickly because you were relying currently on something called System 1 thinking. It's a very automatic, fast, and unconscious kind of thinking, which helps us kind of process everything around us on a day-to-day basis. Usually you don't consume very much energy when you look at stuff like that and you process the information around you. But now let me show you a different picture. So if I ask you again to name the colors of the words that you see, all of a sudden that takes a little bit more time. So it's blue, red, green, and you see that it's much more difficult to do that, although it's a fairly simple task. Why is that? This is because your System 1 thinking is kind of trying to take over right now, and it's trying to scream what it sees, and the context and the wording doesn't really match. And this is where you need to stop and use a little help. And this is where the System 2 type of thinking has to come in, shut down your System 1, and start consuming more energy in order to make sure that you will give the correct answer. So this is a really, really interesting dynamic about our thinking, and most of us have that. And it's also kind of like at the basis of behavioral science and how we use that in order to gain insights in the insurance industry as well. So if I were to sum it up, when you think of this kind of dynamic between your System 1 and System 2, System 1 is in charge of your thinking most of the time, maybe 80%. It's kind of like an autopilot, And then from time to time, you have to encounter problems that are a bit more difficult, and you have to stop and start using this kind of more energy-consuming system 2 type thinking. What that means, it also means that sometimes we fail at what seems to be a fairly easy question because we don't stop to take the energy to get to the right answer. So going forward, if I were to sum up what I just showed you, and kind of how behavioral scientists really like to describe human beings, a lot of the time we think we behave like Mr. Spock. So we like to think that we are rational, and we like to think that we are so-called utility maximizing. This is how economists tend to describe people a lot of the time, and that just means that we process all the information around us, and we like to generally pay the least amount of money in order to get most value for something. If we really are like Mr. Spock, when it comes to influencing behavior, there's very few mechanisms to do that. Either you give people more information, because that's what a rational person would do. They would read everything. So if you had an insurance policy that had 20 pages, you should make it 40, because that's what a rational person will do. They'll just read everything. Or you could change the price, because if a person is really utility maximizing, they would be price driven a lot of the time. In reality, though, behavioral scientists would like to suggest that we are much more like Homer Simpson, which means that we tend to be distracted and even predictably irrational, and that's exactly because of that system 1, system 2 difference. So our brain kind of jumps in and processes information for us before we take the time to get to the right answer. So what do behavioral scientists do with all of this information? So what I'm going to show you next is a few more examples of the ways in which we tend to encounter this bias in our thinking almost every single day. So one of the examples that really captured my imagination when I discovered the subject of behavioral economics was the following. So it goes like this. Say you want to buy a radio, and that radio costs about $20. You go to a store in your neighborhood, you look at the radio, it's exactly what you wanted, you had done your research, you're satisfied, and you're about to take out your money or your credit card and pay for this. Now, all of a sudden, one of your friends maybe texts you and says, hey, actually, I found the exact same things, it's just a few blocks away. You don't have to make that much effort to go get the exact same radio for $10. Now, what do? Do you go to the other store? It sounds like a pretty good deal if you only have to go a few blocks away and pay half the price for the exact same thing. Most of the people say, yeah, of course I go. It's, again, not a trick question at all. Now, say you want to buy a car. So again, you've done all of your research, you know exactly what you want, you went to the car dealership, you sat in the car, you see yourself owning it, and you're about to pay and close the deal. All of a sudden, that same annoying friend who's doing all this research for you says, hey, by the way, just a few blocks away, they have the exact same car, but it's $10 cheaper, so that's a really good deal. You should go do that. Are you going to go to the other store? I see some people shaking that they're not going to do that. But why is it that in the first case, it seems like such a good deal, and in the second case, it doesn't? And if you fell into that, you're not alone, because most people will definitely make the effort to save $10 in the first case, but not in the second case. And the reason they do that is because we tend to think in relative terms. However, that's quite irrational, because $10 is $10. It should always buy you the same thing. So if you're doing that in the first case, not in the second case, you're technically being inconsistent. So this type of thinking definitely affects our decision making. Another example that I really like to show, it's actually a very old study, so it's all the way from 1979. So some scientists put together some couples, husbands and wives. They would separate them into different rooms, and they would ask the question, how much do you think you contribute to the household? in terms of taking out the trash, cooking, taking care of the children, social engagements, things like that. So maybe the wives would answer on average, yeah, well, I think I do about 60% of the contribution in the household, you know, which sounds like a fair number. And then the husbands would say, well, I think I do maybe 65 or so. Well, wait a second, that seems to add to more than 100%. Why is that? So what we call this in behavioral science is the idea of availability bias, and it's the fact that when you ask people about something, what they contribute, what they're doing, they tend to focus inwards. So they focus on what they're doing, their own contribution, and you see this type of behavior, interestingly, in couples, but also in corporations, in teams, and everywhere else around us. And it definitely affects the answers that you receive when you ask people questions about that. So these are just two small examples out of more than 100 biases that we could potentially name in terms of what it is that leads people to behave in certain ways. So a while ago, several entities started actually running trials. And what I'm going to describe to you next is a way this was done by the Behavioral Insights team in the UK in order to understand what drives behavior at Deutsche Bank. So the trial that they had done was the question that Deutsche Bank had asked them was, how could we encourage more people to donate 1 day of their salary to charity? What could we do? So what they did was they had 4 groups of people who were all the same type of employee, but each of them received a different kind of treatment or intervention. So the first group of employees, which was also called the control group, went to work and they got the same kind of standard approach that you would generally see in the corporation. So they received an email from the CEO and it said, "Dear colleague, it's very important that we think of charity. Would you please consider donating 1 day of your salary to this charity?" Okay. The second group, when they came into work, they received a small bag of candy. And that was the only difference of what happened to them versus the other group. The third group didn't get the candy, but what they got was a personalized email. So instead of the generic, "Dear colleague, it's important to donate to charity," it actually said, "Dear David," or "Dear John," whatever. And it was a much more personal email that was seemingly written to them from the CEO. And the last group received a combination of both the sweets and the personal touch. And when you look at the difference and how they behaved was, you can see that on average, a person who receives a standard kind of approach donated about 5% of them donated a day of their salary to charity. When you either gave them a bag of sweets or a personal email, all of a sudden that number doubled. So 11 and 12% of these people ended up donating. And in the last group, you actually see a tripling of the number of people who donated. So it goes all the way up to 17%. Now, these interventions are extremely small, and it doesn't really take a lot of effort to do that. And the last group is impressive at 17%, but actually what I find much more interesting about this experiment was the difference between 2 and 3, the sweets and the personal image. Because buying this bag of candy costs you money. So you double the amount of people who donate by giving them something. But being nice and just writing a personal email which uses the employee's name doesn't cost you anything at all. And it's actually a higher performance than when you had to actually give something, a physical thing to them. So that's a really, really interesting insight. So what we've done in our behavioral research unit is we looked at these kind of examples that we kept seeing all over the world and especially in the public policy sector, and we said, well, could we start applying this kind of testing, this test and learn approach to the insurance industry? And what kind of things could we learn there? What kind of things could we see driving consumer behavior in the insurance space? And that's exactly what we've done. So we've done this for about 3 years now. And the more and more we spend time thinking about consumer behavior in the insurance space, we actually came up to this kind of model. So if you think of this as a pie or as a depiction of the customer journey, basically we know that at every point of your interaction with the customer, there's different pain points and there's different behaviors that we would like to see more in insurance. So you could think of ways to apply behavioral science at the underwriting point. And one of the questions that we receive very often is, how could we encourage customers to disclose more about themselves? How could we get people to be more honest? The second kind of obvious place is sales. So how could we get people to increase, to be more interested in our products? How could we get people to buy more? A third place is possibly retention. So how do we keep our customers with us? How is it that we are approaching them at that time? And last but definitely not least is the claims area, because that's a place where you see a lot of complaints coming from and a lot of stuff. So we've been focusing on these kind of 4 areas, and we've been taking the same approach that I just shared you, this test and learn with the different intervention groups. And so far, we've been able to do more than 120 trials. We've done that in more than 30 countries, which is quite important because we get to see, do behaviors hold between different countries? Will people react to the same kind of bias depending on where you're looking? And we've done this with about 5 million or more insurance customers, which is very interesting because you get to observe behavior in kind of a live environment and what people actually do as opposed to a lab setting. And why do we do this? What is our ultimate aim? Basically, we just want to help insurance companies understand what the true drivers of customers' behavior are. So this was a very quick introduction to a lot of stuff, so behavioral science, what it means, what other people are doing, this fancy pie. But can I make it more tangible for you? So I hope so. And what I'd like to share with you now is 3 main lessons that we've learned in the last 3 years and show you some actual case studies of how we've actually applied behavioral science to each of those slices of that pie. So the biggest lesson in underwriting was very interesting for us, and it took us a while to get to it. And to some of you, it may seem quite obvious. But it was that when you look at customers in general, and their tendency to be dishonest, they are more likely to be dishonest about lifestyle questions as opposed to really serious conditions. So generally that's stuff about drinking, smoking, how much one eats, height and weight, minor conditions. If you ask about things like cancer or maybe a heart attack, people very, very rarely lie about that because it's something you could find out very easily anyway. Why do people feel more at ease to either exaggerate and underreport about these other areas? The answer is very simple. We like to fool ourselves. So it's not necessarily always on purpose. Maybe sometimes we don't even know we're doing, or it's wishful thinking. Maybe I will give you my target weight, or maybe I will say, well, I didn't smoke that much yesterday, and I will continue this good behavior. And I love an example that I came across a while ago. So someone was trying to start up a business in the US selling custom-made blue jeans. So it was a completely online model. And what the persons would have to do is send in their measurements. Now, about 30% of the customers would then complain when they would receive the pants. And they would say, well, I got it, but it doesn't fit me. I found that amazing because when you think about it, it was absolutely 100% in their interest to be honest and give you the real measurements. And yet even there you see 30% of the people being wrong. Now what about insurance? I mean, here you have a set of customers who is possibly much less committed to giving you the right answer. So what we've tested is all sorts of things. We looked at ways in which you might remind people that they should be moral and honest. or maybe the ranges that you give in the questionnaire. For example, if you ask someone, how much do you smoke a day? And you give them 3 boxes. And it usually goes 0 to 5, 5 to 10, 10 to 15. Any kind of normal human being doesn't really like to be in that last box. And also they kind of feel that probably it's the worst box to be in anyway. So we'll find a way to put ourselves in the middle. Now what happens if you would change that range and maybe make it from 0 to 60 and have 5 boxes? Maybe all of a sudden, if you smoke 35 a day, but that's the 3rd or the 4th box, you don't feel so bad because you're still in the middle, and there's someone who is doing worse than you because they're like, oh, I smoke 35, they're smoking 50, I think I'm doing very, very well, you know? So you don't have much of a problem putting yourself there. Or maybe the question order matters. A lot of the underwriting forms we see, they ask people about all sorts of conditions, and they generally tend to get kind of more and more grave, so worse and worse and worse. And you're asking people, did you do this, did you have this, yes or no? And as the person goes down along that questionnaire, it seems like it's a bigger and bigger deal to say yes, and maybe you don't want to do that. But what happens if you actually start mixing a lot of those questions around so that you don't create this pattern? Because a lot of the time it could be subconscious. So in general, when we've tested kind of changes to these type of things, we've seen about 2 to 5 percentage points increase in disclosure, which is quite a big impact given that a lot of our interventions take very, very little effort. And I'll show you exactly how we did one. So in this case, we were dealing with an Australian insurer, and they had this very typical question. It was saying, well, we know that our insurance customers are not always being very honest when we're asking them stuff, so could you help? So when we looked at the underwriting form, and this was early days for our behavioral research unit, we thought about this idea that most people don't really want to be dishonest. They just need a little bit of help in order to remember that they should be honest. Now, if you think about, you know, the movies and when someone is kind of in court and they have to give honest statements, you see that they put their hand on the Bible and they say, I swear to say the truth and nothing but the truth. And they do that at the beginning. They don't do that at the end. In the underwriting form, people are asked questions and they sign at the bottom their name and they say, I told you the truth and I understand what it means. But they do that at the end. Now, do you really think that if someone was not being entirely honest is going to go back and change any of the answers, especially if they wrote them in pen? Probably not. So what we did is we took that box from the bottom and we moved it to the top. We had 4,000 people. 2,000 had the regular one, so the thing where they sign at the bottom, and the other 2,000 had the new one where they sign at the top. And then we did the same thing as you always do, and we simply compared the two groups and what we saw in terms of disclosure. So what we saw is systematically about 3 percentage points increase in the amount, in the number of people who would either say that yes, they have been using unprescribed drugs, or yes, they are drinking alcohol over a certain threshold. We've been able to do this test and learn approach in several countries so far, and we tend to see the same magnitude of change in disclosure, which is a very, very interesting learning as well, because you might come to different countries and say, oh no, in my country this will work, or in my country this will lead to about 10 or 15% increase. No, it's been generally about 3 percentage points. Does that matter? Is that a big enough number? We believe that yes. Because in this case, we had about 100,000 people in the portfolio, which means that all of a sudden, 3,000 of those people will be in a very different category because of the answers that you've been able to get. Going forward, if you think of the other 3 slices of that pie, so sales, claims, and retention. One of the things that we've seen most often with insurance companies is that there's this instinct to nudge or try to influence people to behave by using very traditional methods, which is very, very understandable. So usually we see people trying to use financial incentives, like that bag of sweets, to get people to act differently. But a question that we've been focusing on is, well, okay, that works, but it also costs you a lot of money. What would happen if you just spend more time thinking about the language that you're using when you're speaking with your customer? Is there any impact that we can create there? The answer is absolutely yes. We've done quite a bit of test and learn in those 3 areas as well. And by doing that, we managed to increase the sales, to obtain higher engagement rates, especially in the digital space, to get faster turnaround times when it comes to claims, and definitely higher retention rates. And all of this has been done much of the time by simply changing the language that's being used when you are trying to interact with the customer. And I'll show you a few case studies of how we've accomplished some of these things. So the first one is from the digital space. In this case, we were working with a Japanese insurer, and what they already knew about their customers was that if they already make the step of requesting a pamphlet or a catalog to be sent to their home, they're much, much more likely to buy life insurance. So the behavior that they wanted to encourage was to get more people to request this pamphlet. We looked at the web page that they were using, and we saw that they had 2 actions that someone could take when they would go to the page. So you could either get a quote, or you could request a pamphlet. Very typically of what we do, we thought about it and we said, okay, how could we change some of this in a very small way? So we made a very subtle change. So we said, if you know how much cover you need, then you should get a quote. If you don't know how much cover you need, you should request a pamphlet. It's not a big change at all. And our thinking was that we are simply removing an extra step or a mental barrier, because people don't have to think about why they might want to take this action. We made that very clear for them. The result we saw was essentially a doubling in the number of people who would all of a sudden go into the second group of requesting a pamphlet. Very importantly, the people who would get a quote remained the same, which was also a behavior that we did not want to change. Again, you look, well, we went from roughly 3 to 6% when it comes to the people who are clicking on the second button. Is that a lot? We think it is, and especially with this client, we've been able to do the same kind of testing in page after page after page. And if you start getting these type of incremental change in behavior, that can add up quite quickly, because you have to think about the different pain points or the different small behaviors that you want to encourage or change at every step of the way. A second case study has to do with lapse. And this is something that we've done in the UK, and it has been a very, very interesting study. So the insurance company with whom we're working here has a very interesting model. They offer free income protection to students, either medical or dental students who are still in school. They do this for free. So essentially you go sign up for income protection, and for 12 to 18 months, you don't have to pay anything, but if something happens, you will have this cover. The idea is that when you graduate and you get a job, then you are going to get switched to a paying policy. And that's the model of the insurance company. Very interestingly, about 5% of these students were displaying an irrational behavior. So they would sign up, they would receive the information pack, and then they would drop off. So they would cancel the policy. And you would say, well, why would you do that? It's for free. It doesn't really make any sense. And there could be lots of reasons as to why people are doing that. But the question was, could we decrease that initial drop in people who cancel the policies? Because if we do that, the chance of keeping them with us are much higher further down the road. So what we did, was we looked at the welcome package that the insurance company was sending to these students. And it looked roughly like this. It was about 4 pages. And then we thought about ways to change that letter. And that was the only thing that we changed. So in general, it was 4 pages. We felt like that's a lot to read. So we made it shorter. We made it only 2 pages. There's a lot of emphasis on contractual, so quite a heavy language, using jargon, and speaking as if someone really is familiar with insurance. So we simplified a lot of that language. We made it much more straightforward. We also removed the talk of refunding the premium, because there was no premium. And very interestingly, when we asked them, well, why are you talking about it? They kind of said, well, you know, it was there and we didn't know if we can really take it out or change it because someone else was doing that. And then we cut down the emphasis on cancellation. There was a lot of talk of how you should cancel this policy. So we definitely kept that in there, but we did not focus so much on that. And when the numbers started coming in, after we introduced these changes to the letter, we saw a decrease in these early cancellations of 61%. And again, this is an interesting case because this is an insurance company with whom we've been working at different points of their interaction with the customer. So you have this early cancellation, you have when the process when the students graduate and get this first letter asking for a payment. You have all sorts of things like that. And if you systematically achieve kind of decreases and lapse along that way, those can add up very quickly for them. The last example I'd like to share with you comes from the claims area. So that's that last slice of the pie. So again, this was in the UK. And this insurance company was saying, well, sometimes we get these claims and we know that they're valid and we'd like to pay them right away. However, we have to wait for the doctors to write a letter back to us, and they have to confirm that the patient really has that condition. That can take a lot of time, sometimes more than a month, and it's very frustrating to us because we can't serve our customers well, and to the claimants because they have to wait for a long time for their money. Can you do anything to help and get the doctors to send these letters back quicker? So we looked at what it is that was being sent to the doctors, and we created 2 different interventions. So for critical illness, we wrote an extra sentence in the letter that was going to the doctors to say, did you know that the quickest doctors respond in as little as 3 days? Can you do the same? This is the idea of anchoring. So the fact that if you give someone kind of like a reference point, it stays with them, it stays in the back of their head, and maybe they're not going to react immediately, but it will make them more likely to keep that and take that into account when they're doing something. For terminal illness, which has a different definition, so it's defined as having less than 12 months left to live, we decided to take a different approach. So we actually put a handwritten post-it note on the letters that were going out to the doctors, so kind of having an emotional effect and a personal touch. So what the post-it note had was, your patient may only have 12 months left to live. Please don't delay this process. Thank you. So I know that in some countries this seems like really a lot, but in the UK this was completely okay. So again, when we tracked what happened after we started using this different approach, we saw a 10 percentage point increase in the amount of letters that would come quicker when it came to critical illness, and about 9 percentage point increase in the number of letters that would come back quicker when it came to terminal illness. A very interesting difference was that for the critical illness, when the letters came back quicker, this was statistically significant within 30 days. For terminal illness, this was statistically significant at 10 days. So if a doctor reacted they reacted much quicker to the terminal illness one, which also makes sense because it's something much more emotional. In this case, in the terminal illness one, we actually had 2 doctors respond back with their own post-it notes. And it said, "I know my patient better than you. Don't tell me how to do my job." Interestingly, they responded within 1 or 2 days. And again, we take a lot of time thinking about the context and what's acceptable in the culture. In this case, the insurance company knows their doctors very well, so that was completely okay. In some other countries, we would never even dream to use something like a post-it note. But this is just to show the kind of things that we could do and the kind of biases that we could use when we are changing a process. So going forward to lesson number 3, which was a very, very important one for us. So the more we started running this test and learn approach, we would get asked very often by insurance companies questions like, well, why do we need to do a test and learn? Can't you just come in and give us like a checklist or some best practices of things that we should just do when we interact with the customers? Or, well, can't you just come in and do one thing and it's gonna kind of fix everything? So just have an intervention one time. So the answer is no, we don't believe that. And the kind of best parallel I've been able to come up with is, you know, when you have a headache and you take an aspirin, you never hear someone saying, well, if I take an aspirin today, will I never have a headache? No, you know that it's going to fix the problem, and then the next time you're in pain, you're going to have an intervention again. And your interaction with insurance customer is actually very similar because a lot of the time you see different pain points or recurring pain points, and they tend to change and they tend to be different depending on the context in which they're happening. So we believe that test and learn should be very much kind of a mentality. It should be something that you start incorporating into your business model and kind of get into this habit of testing and discarding things very quickly without spending a lot of effort on it. Because if you tried it and you failed, or if you tried and it worked and you did that over and over again, it's a much easier kind of process to accept as opposed to making big sweeping changes to your system and then being disappointed when those don't really work. And it's a very, very simple process. So the first question you can ask is, well, what is the pain point that I'm experiencing? What is it that I would like to change in terms of the behavior of my customer? The second one is to really think of the diagnosis of the problem. So if you have a web page, where is it that you are losing customers within that journey? Sometimes it's very easy. If it's only a letter that you are sending to people, well, it's actually quite easy. You just try to make changes to that letter. So the step number 3 is to design an intervention. So think, what kind of biases could people possibly be experiencing? So what's the one thing that you could tweak? What's the one thing that you could change? And then how could you implement and track that change in behavior? Measuring and tracking how people are reacting to change is very, very interesting because it helps you understand the change in behavior, but much of the time we also see that it helps insurance companies understand much more about the rest of that kind of environment in which they're interacting with customers. Step 5 is to analyze the numbers and understand what happened. And last but not least, this very important last step, to be willing to repeat in order to see, does that kind of intervention hold? Is that something that is kind of like a feature of your customer set, which is a tweak that you could permanently make in the way you do business or not? So if I were to sum this up, we don't think that there's a silver bullet, but understanding the context is key, and getting kind of used to this test and learn mindset is very important. So these were the 3 lessons that we've learned in the last 3 years. And we still think that we are at the beginning of this journey. And you may ask, well, what are you going to do next? I mean, we've done these 120 trials, we've been in these 30 countries, we've done all that stuff, and it's definitely very interesting. I mean, we've learned lots of things about lots of different types of people, but what does that really mean for the insurance industry, aside from the fact that it's very interesting? So again, we think that you can create real value with this type of approach and this test and learn mindset. So if you were to think what it means when you get better disclosure in the underwriting space, well, it's quite obvious. You have increased accuracy, and for example, you could become better at reserving. You could become better at risk selection. When it comes to the other slices of the pie, you can see these small little tweaks. And you can say, well, 3 percentage points here, 3 percentage points there. Does that really matter? We believe that yes, because if you do this along the customer journey, along the value chain, those things really can add up. So examples of the type of value that we've created for some of our partners have been, for example, 5.5 million increase in premiums over a lifetime policy. This is about $6 million US dollars. Or I think 18 billion pesos. And then, in retention, we've created about 7 million for another customer. And then in claims, we're currently running a trial where we're trying to get more people to accept rehabilitation offers. And we know that if we really achieve this change, that means about 1.5 million US dollars in savings for them as well. So we believe we're just starting. And the things I've described seem quite small, they seem quite easy to do, but the potential for the insurance industry in investing in this kind of additional thinking about the customer language and in the way we approach problem solving and design can be quite huge, as you see. So with that, thank you very much. And if you have some questions, please.
Data Crédito Experian ofrece soluciones especializadas para aseguradoras. Solución para calificación de intermediarios. Permite a las aseguradoras calificar el comportamiento crediticio y comercial de sus intermediarios a través de información relevante y veraz y dando cumplimiento con la circular número 050. Solución para suscripción riesgo personas. Aporta la información de comportamiento crediticio como variable relevante en el proceso de fijación de precios. Solución SARLAFT. Agiliza el proceso de captura y actualización de datos, dando cumplimiento a la normatividad de conocimiento de clientes. Solución Suscripción Cumplimiento. Permite agilizar la suscripción de las pólizas de cumplimiento, a partir de la información que suministra sobre riesgo crediticio y comportamiento comercial. Solución Segmentación. Incorpora variables de estilo de vida y nivel de endeudamiento para el diseño de campañas más focalizadas y efectivas. Solución Identificación de fraude. Genera alertas al momento de la suscripción basadas en los hallazgos de la información.